Attica Correctional Facility is a name that conjures up some of the darkest chapters in American prison history. Constructed during the Great Depression, this fortress-like institution was built to embody a strict, non-nonsense approach to punishment, where containment took precedent over rehabilitation. Set against the turbulent backdrop of urbanization and rising crime, Attica's imposing design mirrored the era's penal philosophy, a testament to isolation and control. And over the decades, this prison in rural New York would become more than a facility. It would evolve into a powerful symbol of racial tension, failure, and the controversial yet ongoing struggle for human rights behind bars. So what really went on at Attica, and just why did this prison shake the nation on that fateful day back in 1971? And what many claim was America's worst prison riot. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start at the beginning. When Attica Correctional Facility, one of the last big houses, was constructed in 1931. It was built in response to rapid urbanization and industrialization, which led to a growing population and increased crime. Prisons at the time were overcrowded and conditions were miserable. The era's penal philosophy leaned heavily towards punishment rather than rehabilitation. Hence, to alleviate these issues, the state began searching for a location to build a new prison. Settling on Attica. Attica is a rural town in western New York with vast open land. In other words, out of sight, out of mind, meaning this was the perfect location for the new facility. Construction on the Attica Correctional Facility began in 1931. The prison's design reflected harsh criminal punishment. Imposing and fortress-like, Attica was conceived as a maximum security institution to hold the most hardened criminals, with founding principles rooted in strict control. This was part of a broader societal view that prisoners needed to be kept in check, often through force and as far removed from society as possible. With its towering walls, guard towers, and stringent security protocols, Attica truly embodied the philosophy of the time. In fact, it was not unique to this facility. Prisons elsewhere that took a hard stance on crime had experienced riots as a protest to this approach. For example, in 1929, Auburn State Prison experienced 2 major riots, and those influenced the construction of Attica as a maximum security prison. As the prison filled its cells, the state's growing incarcerated population continued to mirror the economic and social tensions of the time. From the Great Depression to post-World War II, America's financial struggles fed into the challenges of prison management. One key challenge observed by contemporary activists state that many of the inmates at Attica were from marginalized communities, particularly African American and Hispanic populations. In their view, this reflects a broader pattern of inequity in arrest, sentencing, and incarceration. And by the 1960s, as civil rights movements took shape across the U.S., the stark disparities and harsh conditions within prisons like Attica were increasingly scrutinized. Prisons had become microcosms of societal unrest, with growing tensions between inmates and prison authorities. And so it was. Attica, a now heavily overcrowded institution, became a powder keg. To that point, its strict disciplinary system, racial divisions, and poor living conditions set the stage for what would later become one of the most infamous uprisings in U.S. prison history. Tensions rose when groups like the Third World, Black Power, and New Left movement made claims of repression and demanded better living conditions. Their advocates pointed out that 54% of prisoners at the time were African American, while 9% were Puerto Rican, and 34% were Caucasian, complaining that all of the guards were white, except one, according to sources. And although to the best of our research, they did not control for reasons behind those statistics beyond race, such as economic status or education, they went on to attest that the guards often threw out letters that were meant for Puerto Rican prisoners or those that contained Spanish language. Another disparity that they proved was that African American prisoners were relegated to the lowest paying jobs within the prison and harassed by guards often, creating a pretty nasty rift between inmates and guards, a rift only made worse by the fact that most inmates were from urban areas, whereas the guards were from local Attica. Despite the intense unrest and building tension, rioting had not occurred in the prison by July of 1971, despite other prisons experiencing very large riots. Rather than immediately rioting, a group of inmates created a list of 27 demands to improve their living conditions. These demands included healthier diets, better guards, rehabilitation programs, and more. Needless to say, the prison commissioner instituted none of these changes. So, by August of 1971, one of the final catalysts for the massive riot that happened was when George Jackson, a prominent member of the Black Panther Party and author, was killed during an escape attempt. Over 700 Attica inmates participated in a hunger strike in his honor, and even more were likely encouraged by his writing that implored inmates to become politically active. On Wednesday, September the 8th, 1971, tensions at Attica Correctional Facility erupted. The story goes, during a routine recreation break, a fight broke out between two inmates, and when the correctional officers stepped in to intervene, the situation escalated quickly. Although one of the inmates had already left, the officer insisted that the other return to his cell, leading to a heated argument. In a moment of anger, the inmate struck the officer. This altercation drew in more inmates and guards, with another prisoner joining the fray and hitting the officer as well. Before the situation could spiral out of control completely, however, Lieutenant Robert Curtis intervened, successfully de-escalating the violence for a moment. Later that evening, Warden Vincent Mancusi ordered the two inmates involved to be placed in solitary confinement in 5 Company, a section of the prison. But the situation took yet another turn when officers came to remove them from their cells. Prisoners in 5 Company resisted, throwing objects and shouting at the guards. The tension was tangible, and it boiled over when one inmate, William Orbit, hit an officer with a can of soup. The following day, Thursday, September the 9th, the situation grew more dangerous. The prisoners in 5 Company were outraged over Orbit's punishment and demanded to know his fate. Their frustration was met with evasiveness from the guards, which only fueled their anger further. So, in perhaps an unwise move, as the inmates were led to breakfast, they opened Orbit's cell, allowing him to join them in the mess hall. This breach of control did not go unnoticed by the prison's command staff, who quickly decided to return all of 5 Company's men to their cells. However, the correctional officers were not fully informed of the plan due to a communication failure. After breakfast, the inmates were led towards a recreation area where they were shocked to find that the doors were locked, a clear signal to them that punishment was imminent. Fear and frustration triggered chaos. Some inmates attacked the guards while others tried to escape the growing violence. The outcry of disorder spread rapidly, engulfing nearby sections of the prison. And now, what had started as a scuffle quickly escalated into a full-scale uprising. By noon, Attica was divided. Half of the prison remained under the authorities' control, while 1,281 inmates took command of the other half, including the infamous D-Yard, the 2 main tunnels, and the central control room, which they dubbed Times Square. They held 42 guards and civilian staff hostage, cementing the seriousness of the revolt. The uprising began, and its consequences soon rippled far beyond the prison walls. Once inmates had secured their section of the prison, they swiftly moved to organize themselves. Leaders were elected to represent the prisoners in negotiations, while others took on roles such as medics and security to maintain order and care for those injured. The inmates quickly began drafting a list of demands, establishing a unified front to present their grievances and demands to officials and conditions for surrender. Spurred by passionate speeches from figures like Elliot Barkley, the prisoners rallied together with a shared purpose and determination. The resulting document, known as the Attica Liberation Faction Manifesto of Demands, captured the frustrations and aspirations of the perpetrators. Addressed to the, quote, sincere people of society, the manifesto called for fundamental human rights within the prison system. It listed 33 specific demands covering issues such as improved medical care, fair visitation rights, better food quality, religious freedoms, higher wages for inmate labor, and an end to physical abuse. But the prisoners also wanted some basic things: like access to hygiene necessities such as toothbrushes and daily showers. 5 elected representatives negotiated on behalf of the inmates. Tensions mounted, however, as negotiations unfolded between the inmates and Russell Oswald, the New York Commissioner of Corrections. Oswald initially agreed to implement 28 of the demands, but 2 key points, granting amnesty for those involved in the uprising and removing Attica's warden, remained unresolved. The lawyer volunteering to represent the inmates later described these as the prisoners' only 2 non-negotiable terms. He remarked, quote, "The prisoners had 2 non-negotiable demands, the removal of the warden and general amnesty. And they had already given up on the removal of the warden. We had to work out several formulas on the general amnesty, were discussed with the commissioner hours before the attack. If we had been allowed to continue, everybody would be alive. The matter would be settled today." The stalemate deepened when New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller decided not to visit Attica. Despite appeals from Oswald and members of the Observer Committee to calm the situation through his presence, Rockefeller refused. Some analysts later suggest that his absence had exacerbated this crisis, removing an opportunity to de-escalate the tension and open further dialogue. And then, when negotiations stalled, Rockefeller and Oswald decided to authorize a forceful retake of the prison, a move that would later be heavily scrutinized. On the night of Sunday, September the 12th, 1971, plans were finalized to retake control of Attica Correctional Facility by force. Observers on the negotiation team encouraged Commissioner Russell Oswald to make at least one last attempt at a peaceful resolution, suggesting a statement to the inmates to release the guards they had captive and to accept the proposed settlement. Although Oswald communicated this to the inmates on the morning of September the 13th, he withheld any indication that forceful measures would be followed if they refused, leaving inmates unaware that the negotiations had concluded. In response, the inmates fortified their area in preparation, creating defensive barriers and readying themselves for a potential confrontation. They brought several hostages to a visible position to underscore their demands, hoping to signal their willingness to further negotiate. Despite these efforts, by 9:46 a.m., law enforcement deployed tear gas into the yard, followed by a coordinated entry of state police troopers and other personnel to retake the facility. This intense push brought the situation to a devastating end within minutes, ultimately resulting in significant loss of life among both hostages and inmates. In the aftermath of this, officials initially reported that inmates had killed hostages, claims widely circulated by the media. However, it soon emerged that fatalities among hostages were caused by law enforcement. Despite medical examiners confirming this within hours, state officials were too slow to correct the narrative, leading to further public outcry. The aftermath was also marked by intense scrutiny. This pattern of retaliation extended to other facilities, where prisoners had also protested, exposing issues in the correctional system and contributing to the lasting calls for reform. Following the uprising at Attica Correctional Facility, a wave of protest and prison riots swept across the United States, spanning from states like Georgia to New York. According to the Prison Solidarity Committee, 13 prison rebellions took place within just 3 weeks after the event at Attica, a stark increase that underscored the uprising's impact on the broader prison system. Protests in support of the Attica inmates spread to major cities, including Los Angeles and New York, with notable figures like Angela Davis and John Lennon voicing their support for the prisoners and criticizing the state's action. In response to growing public outcry, Governor Rockefeller established the New York State Special Commission on Attica, also known as the Decay Commission. This investigative body was tasked with examining the uprising and evaluating the state's handling of it. Published in September of 1972, the commission's report was openly critical of Rockefeller and the Department of Corrections, especially highlighting failures in managing the prison's retaking and protecting the inmates from harsh reprisals. This report became a key document, shedding a light on deep-rooted issues within the prison system and serving as a catalyst for future prison reform across the U.S. Following the Attica uprising, investigations and legal actions unfolded over many years. The state appointed special prosecutors to investigate possible crimes, leading to indictment of many inmates. However, only one state trooper was charged, and allegations arose that evidence of misconduct by law enforcement was ignored. This led Malcolm Bell, a prosecutor, to expose potential cover-ups, sparking further investigation. The resulting Meyer report acknowledged significant errors but claimed no intentional cover-up. However, portions of the report were kept sealed, leading to ongoing demands for transparency from prison staff and inmate advocates. By 1976, Governor Carey closed the book on these criminal prosecutions, issuing pardons and commuting sentences related to the uprising. Civil lawsuits, however, continued as inmates and families of those killed sued New York State for civil rights abuses, eventually resulting in an inmate settlement of $12 million in the year 2000, followed by a similar settlement for staff in 2005. The lasting impact of Attica spurred some inmate reforms within New York's prison system, such as improving access to necessities, including a grievance process and allowing greater religious freedom. Educational programs and a new legal aid network for prisoners were also established. Yet many of these reforms eroded in the years that followed, especially during the 1980s and 1990s tough-on-crime era. Overcrowding worsened, and funding was cut, specifically those from the 1994 crime bill that eliminated Pell Grants and removed educational opportunities for inmates. So, despite temporary improvements, reports of difficult conditions and limited accountability continued at Attica, with ongoing calls for reform and transparency. By 1999, New York's prison population had soared once again, from 12,500 at the time of the Attica incident to over 72,000, leading to increased overcrowding and strained resources on prisons across the state. A notion that perhaps suggests that this is an issue without a solution. And with that being said, I'd love to hear from those of you who are actually incarcerated at Attica. Share your stories in the comments section below so that we can get a more authentic perspective on the prison. Otherwise, if you'd like to hear an even more disturbing story about New York prisoners, don't miss our episode on Why Hart Island is Totally Forbidden by clicking right here. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off. And if you guys are still watching, click the subscribe button, okay?